The train's whistle was a lonely scream against the wind. It was the only sound Helena had heard for hours that was not the rhythmic clatter of the wheels or the high, thin shriek of the air through the pass. When the grinding stop finally came, the silence that followed felt vast and dangerous. She was the only one to disembark. The station, if one could call it that, was a single-story box of rough-hewn timber, stained dark by weather and soot. It was not a town. It was an outpost, a punctuation mark of humanity pressed flat against the enormous, bruised purple backdrop of the mountains. Helena stepped from the iron stairs onto the splintered platform. The wind hit her instantly, a physical blow that stole the air from her lungs. It was a cold she had not known existed, a cold that felt alive, searching for her bones. Her shawl, a threadbare triangle of wool, was useless. Her dress, patched and thin, might as well have been paper. She wrapped her arms around herself, a movement so practiced it was involuntary. Her worn boots, the soles slick and thin from 1,000 miles of walking before the train, offered no protection from the cold seeping up from the wood. She stood there, shivering, a small, dark shape against the immense landscape, clutching the single carpet bag that held everything she owned, a torn Bible and a spare set of rags. She waited. She did not know for how long. The train, having exhaled its one passenger, hissed and groaned, preparing to move on, to abandon her at the edge of the world. A man separated himself from the shadow of the station wall. He was tall, broader than she had expected. The land had carved him. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a stained hat, but she could see the dark, untrimmed beard and the deep lines etched around his eyes. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat, and he moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, as if he never wasted a single step. This was Eli Thatcher, her husband, according to the curt letter from the agency. He stopped 10 feet from her. His gaze was not unkind, nor was it kind. It was practical. It measured her. He had sent money for passage, specifying his needs in a short, blunt letter. He needed a wife, someone sturdy, who understood work, someone to manage the house, to cook, to mend, someone to break the crushing solitude of the homestead. He had paid for sturdy. He had received this. Eli had seen starving calves with more life in their eyes. The woman standing before him was rail-thin, her skin almost translucent, pulled taut over a delicate frame of bone. She looked like a strong gust might shatter her. He felt a sharp, unfamiliar spike of irritation, not at her, but at the agency, at the world, at this complication. This was not a helper. This was another mouth to feed, another fragile thing to protect from the winter. He saw her shiver, a violent tremor that shook her whole body. He saw her knuckles, white as bleached bone, where she gripped the handle of her bag. He saw the deep, purple bruises of exhaustion under her eyes. He had expected to feel something, perhaps relief, perhaps resignation. He did not expect to feel this deep, hollow stun. Helena met his gaze. She could not, would not, look away. She had learned that looking away invited cruelty. She held his stare, her own eyes wide, dark and empty of everything but a desperate, animal will to simply remain. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind. Eli Thatcher said nothing. He simply shrugged himself out of his heavy sheepskin coat. He took 2 long strides and, without asking permission, draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it almost buckled her knees. It was heavy, so heavy, and blessedly warm. It smelled of wood smoke, of leather, of horse, and of the faint, clean scent of the man himself. It swallowed her whole. She clutched the lapels, burying her face in the high collar, drawing in a breath that was the first truly warm thing she had felt in months. She looked up, her face half hidden. "Helena?" His voice was rough, like gravel, as if he had not used it in days. She could not find her own. She only nodded, a small, jerky movement. "The wagon's this way." He lifted her bag from her unresisting fingers, his other hand moving to the small of her back, a touch that was not intimate, but merely directional, a touch that guided, as one would guide livestock. He steered her away from the platform, toward a simple buckboard wagon hitched to two heavy draft horses. Their journey had begun. The town of Bitter Hollow was not on the way to the ranch, but Eli had to stop for supplies. He pulled the wagon up in front of the general store, the only two-story building on the muddy, rutted track that served as Main Street. He left her on the wagon seat. "Stay put." Helena sat, rigid, the heavy coat a protective shell, but it could not protect her from the eyes. Bitter Hollow was a small town, and the arrival of the afternoon train was a social event. The appearance of Thatcher, a man who lived so far out he was considered more mountain myth than neighbor, was a spectacle. And the woman he had with him? That was a scandal. Two women in thick wool skirts, carrying baskets from the store, stopped dead on the boardwalk. They whispered, their hands covering their mouths, though the wind carried their words clearly. "Is that Thatcher?" "Sakes, it is. And look what he's got. That's the mail-order bride. She looks consumed, like she's got the lung sickness. Or the pox. Heard they send whores from the east when they get desperate." Helena flinched, pulling the collar higher. She focused on a knot of wood in the wagon's floorboard, willing herself to be invisible. A group of men, loafers outside the saloon, turned their attention from their whittling. One of them, smelling of stale whiskey, staggered a few feet closer. "Well now, Eli," the man yelled, grinning through a broken row of teeth. "Finally bought yourself some company. She look a little thin, don't she? Need to fatten her up for the winter." The other men laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Desperate folk marrying shadows," muttered the storekeep, Mr. Henderson, as he pushed a barrel of flour onto the boardwalk. He glanced at Helena, his face a mask of pinched disapproval, then looked away as if she were unclean. Helena felt the familiar, hot sting of shame behind her eyes, but she would not cry. She had cried all her tears in a damp cellar in Pennsylvania. She had nothing left for these strangers. Eli emerged from the store, his arms laden with a sack of flour and a large tin of coffee. He moved with the same unhurried pace. He did not look at the men. He did not look at the women. He simply loaded his supplies into the back of the wagon, his movements economical and precise. "You'd best leave that one alone." "Thatcher!" the drunk man called out again, emboldened by Eli's silence. "She's got the look of bad luck." Eli stopped. He did not turn. He simply finished tying down the flour sack. Then, slowly, he straightened. He turned his head, his gaze fastening on the man by the saloon. He said nothing. He just looked. The man's smile faltered. He shuffled, the bravado leaking out of him. He looked down, then spat on the ground, and finally retreated into the dark cavern of the saloon. Eli climbed back onto the wagon seat. He picked up the reins, clicked his tongue, and the horses strained, pulling the wagon into motion. He had not said a word in her defense. He had not needed to. The silence he carried was louder and more threatening than any shout. The journey to the ranch was 4 hours. It took them out of the valley, up into the snow-laced pine forests. The world grew quieter, the air thinner. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the steady, mournful sigh of the wind through the high branches. Helena sat beside him, silent, her hands clenched together in the coat's deep pockets. She watched the landscape pass, a blur of white and green and granite gray. It was beautiful, she thought, in a terrible, savage way. It was a land that did not care if you lived or died. It was empty. She passed wind-beaten plains where the snow had been scoured away, revealing the frozen, brown grass beneath. She had never seen so much emptiness. It terrified her, but a small, strange part of her found it cleansing. There were no alleyways here to be cornered in. There were no locked doors. There was only the sky. Eli never spoke. He drove the horses, his eyes constantly scanning the ridge lines, his body moving with the rhythm of the rough-to-patch road. He seemed a part of the landscape, as carved and weathered as the trees. Helena felt a weariness so profound it was almost a physical weight. She was not sure if she was awake or dreaming. She was just a body, being transported. She must have dozed, her head nodding forward, because she startled when the wagon finally stopped. "We're here." The ranch was not a ranch, not as she pictured it. It was a clearing, carved into the side of a mountain, defended by a thick stand of pine. There was a low, solid-looking cabin, smoke rising from its chimney. A sturdy barn stood opposite, and beside the main cabin, there was a second, smaller structure, a shed, or perhaps a small bunkhouse. This was his home. It was the most isolated place she had ever seen. He helped her down, his large hand gripping her elbow. The touch was brief, impersonal, but she was so weak her legs buckled, and he was forced to steady her. She mumbled an apology. He grunted, retrieving her bag. He did not lead her to the main house. He walked to the smaller cabin. He pushed the door open. It swung inward on leather hinges. "This is yours." It was one room. It was bare, and it was cold. A simple cot with a straw-stuffed mattress was pushed against one wall. A small, pot-bellied stove stood in the corner, cold and black. There was a single three-legged stool and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, but the floor was swept, and there was a stack of firewood, neatly cut, beside the stove. "The pump is behind the main house," he said, his voice filling the small space. "The privy is past the barn. I take my meals at sundown. You can join me, or not." He placed her bag on the cot. He stood there, hat in hand, looking impossibly large in the tiny room. He seemed to be struggling with what to say next. "There are matches by the stove," he finally managed. "I'll be in the main house." He turned and left, pulling the door closed behind him, leaving her in the dim, cold gray. Helena stood motionless for a full minute, listening to the sound of his boots crunching in the snow as he walked away. Then, she let his coat slip from her shoulders. It fell to the floor in a heavy, woolen heap. The cold of the room enveloped her. She walked to the cot and sat on the edge of the straw mattress. It rustled beneath her meager weight. She was here. She was safe. Perhaps, was this salvation? Or just a new, colder prison? She did not know. The tension that had held her together for weeks, through the escape, the city, the long, rattling journey west, finally snapped. She lay back on the straw mattress, turned her face to the rough ticking, and cried. She made no sound. The tears were silent, hot and bitter, soaking the coarse fabric. She cried for the baby she had buried in the snow. She cried for the dignity that had been beaten from her. And she cried because she was so very, very tired. Sleep found her, but it was not rest. The nightmares came, as they always did. They came in fragments, disjointed and cruel. The smell of damp earth and rot, the cold, hard-packed floor of the cellar, the sound of heavy measured footsteps on the stairs above, the jingle of a man's belt buckle, a sound that made her stomach turn to ice, and then the cry, a thin, reedy wail, like a kitten, sharp and desperate in the freezing air, the cry that faded, grew distant, and was gone. She woke with a strangled gasp, clutching her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was slick with cold sweat. She was in the small, dark cabin. The wind was howling outside, a low, hungry moan. She was alone, in the main house, 50 feet away. Eli Thatcher was awake. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, listening. The wind carried sounds. He had heard her cry out. A sharp, terrified, "No!" followed by a muffled, desperate sobbing. His first instinct was to go to her, to light the lamp, to see what was wrong. He stayed put. He was a man who understood boundaries. This was a wild land, and you did not approach a spooked animal. You gave it space. You let it see that you were not a threat. He had offered her privacy. To storm in now, in the dark, would be to violate that. It would make him the threat. So he lay there, clenching his fists, and listened to the wind and the quiet, awful sounds of her weeping. He did not speak of it in the morning. He fed her. It was the one thing he knew how to do. He woke before dawn, made coffee, and left a pot of hot oatmeal on the back of his stove. He did not knock on her door. He simply went about his chores. mending a split rail fence at the far end of the new pasture. When he returned late in the morning, the oatmeal was gone, the pot washed and set by his sink. They ate supper together at the small table in his main cabin. It was a silent, awkward affair. The cabin was larger than hers, but just as sparse. It was clean, in a man's way. There were no comforts, just a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and the stove. He served a thick stew of rabbit and potatoes. Helena ate as if she had not seen food in a week, which was close to the truth. She ate quickly, her eyes on her plate. Eli ate slowly, watching her over the rim of his coffee mug. "The letter said you were from Pennsylvania," he said, finally. "Yes," she replied, her voice small. "It's a long way." "Yes." He waited. She felt his patience, a heavy, quiet thing. "I worked as a maid," she offered. It was the easiest part of the truth. He nodded, accepting this. "This is harder work than that." "I am not afraid of work, Mr. Thatcher." "Eli?" She looked down. "Eli." A silence settled. "It's quiet here," she said, "just to fill it." "It is," he said. He looked toward the one small window, though it was dark. "My brother, he didn't like the quiet, said it got inside a man's head." Helena stopped eating. "Your brother?" "Thomas, he was younger. Cattle raid, 2 years past. He's buried on the ridge." He said it flatly, a statement of fact, not a plea for sympathy. The subject was closed. The next day, Helena began to work. She was weak, her body still recovering from months of near starvation. But she was driven by a desperate need to be useful. She scrubbed her own small cabin until the wood planks were pale. Then, tentatively, she moved to his. She swept the floor of the main house. She washed the few dishes. She attempted to cook. It was here she failed. She was not a homestead woman. She was used to a city kitchen, to smaller, manageable tasks. The cast iron stove was a large, black beast, and it was either roaring hot or deathly cold. She was trying to move a heavy pot of water, her hands shaking from the effort and the lingering weakness. Her grip was unsteady. She misjudged the heat of the handle. A sharp, searing pain shot up her arm. She cried out, a small, sharp hiss, and dropped the pot. Hot water splashed across the floor, narrowly missing her feet. Eli was through the door before she could even straighten. He had been splitting wood, and he moved faster than she had ever seen him. He saw her, clutching her right hand to her chest, her face pale, tears of pain welling in her eyes. He didn't speak. He crossed the room in 2 strides, took her by the elbow, and plunged her burned hand into the icy water of the drinking bucket. The shock of the cold made her gasp, but it eased the fire. "Keep it there," he commanded. He left her side, retrieved a clean rag from a drawer, and a small tin of salve. When the throbbing had subsided, he gently dried her hand. His calloused, work-roughened fingers were surprisingly tender. He inspected the burn. It was red and blistering, across her palm and 2 of her fingers. He said nothing. He didn't scold her for her clumsiness. He didn't criticize her. He simply sat her down at the table, took the tin of salve, and began to carefully, gently, dress the wound. He wrapped her fingers and palm in the clean rag, tying it off with a practiced knot. His touch was impersonal, yet it was the kindest touch she had known in her life. When he was finished, he did not get up. He did not go back to his wood. He sat in the chair opposite her, just sat there, in the quiet, firelit kitchen. He just stayed. His presence was a solid, warm wall. He was sitting with her, not as a master, but as a man who respected that she was hurt. That night, back in her own cabin, Helena looked at her bandaged hand. The stove was lit, radiating a deep, steady warmth. Eli had chopped a new pile of kindling and stacked it by her door while she was recovering in his kitchen. She was full of warm stew. She was safe. Her nightmares were waiting for her in the dark. But for this one moment, she was not cold, and she was not hungry. She had faced the scorn of the town. She had made the long, silent journey. She had faced her own ghosts in the dark. And this man, this stranger, had not raised his voice. He had not laid a hand on her in anger. He had fed her. He had clothed her. In his own coat, he had bandaged her. She lay down on the straw mattress. She pulled the rough wool blanket up to her chin. She whispered the words to the darkness. A fragile question. Maybe God really did send me west to live. The snow did not arrive gently. It came with a low, whistling howl from the north. A gray-white wall that erased the mountains. Then the trees. And finally, the 50 feet between her cabin and his. The early days of winter had been a sharp, cold warning. This was the sentence. Helena had never known such a taskmaster as the Montana cold. It demanded constant service. It demanded wood for the stove and water from the pump. And it punished any lapse in tribute. Her life shrank to a series of brutal, repetitive tasks, each one a battle against her own lingering frailty. She was still thin. The food Eli provided slowly rebuilding what years of starvation had taken. But she had no reserves of strength. Hauling water was the worst. The pump was behind the main house, its iron handle so cold it burned her skin even through her patched mittens. She would work the handle, her whole body straining, until the bucket was full. The journey back to her cabin was a slow, agonizing trudge through deepening snow. The water sloshed, freezing instantly to the sides of the bucket, making it heavier with every step. Her bandaged hand had healed, but her new-formed skin was tender, and her muscles screamed. Chopping kindling was a task of grim determination. Eli felled the trees and split the main logs, his axe rising and falling with an economy of motion that mesmerized her. He left her a pile of smaller rounds, but she still had to break them down. She would brace a piece of wood, raise the small hatchet, and bring it down, wincing at the jarring impact. She was clumsy, and the hatchet often glanced off, but she kept at it, her jaw set, until a small, precious pile of kindling was ready. She was outside, her shawl wrapped tight, her breath a cloud of white, trying to fill the wood box beside her door. The snow was falling so thickly she could barely see the barn. A profound, dizzying exhaustion settled over her. It was not just tiredness. It was a deep, cellular depletion. Her arms felt like lead, the hatchet impossibly heavy. She leaned against the cabin wall for just a moment, just to catch her breath. The cold wood leached the warmth from her back. She slid down, sitting in the snow. It felt soft, a dangerous, welcoming softness. She just needed to rest her eyes, just for a minute. She did not feel Eli lift her. She was a thing of rags and bone, and he scooped her up as if she weighed nothing. He did not say a word. He kicked the door of her cabin open and carried her inside. The snow falling from her clothes. The room was frigid. The fire in her stove, nothing but pale. Gray ash. He laid her on the cot, his movements deft and impersonal. He did not tend to her. He tended to the stove. He knelt, scraped out the ash, and with a few practiced movements, had a new fire roaring. He used the kindling she had so painfully chopped. Only when the small stove was radiating a fierce, dry heat did he turn back to her. She was shivering, a low, constant vibration. He went to his own cabin and returned with a heavy, cured buffalo robe. It was an enormous thing, smelling faintly of smoke. He unfolded it and laid it over her, tucking it in around her sides, creating a cocoon of warmth. He pulled the single stool to the side of the cot and sat. He did not try to wake her. He did not try to feed her. He just sat, his large frame filling the tiny room, and watched her. He watched the shallow, fragile movement of her breath. He watched the way her eyelids fluttered with the dark dreams that still haunted her. He sat, a silent guardian, as the blizzard howled, obscured by snow, outside. She woke to a feeling she could not name. Warmth. A deep, penetrating warmth that reached into her bones. The room was close and hot from the stove. She was heavy, pinned down by the massive weight of the buffalo robe. She turned her head. He was there, Eli, sitting on the stool, his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on her. He looked as if he had not moved in hours. She was disoriented, her mind thick with sleep and cold. You're here, she mumbled. You collapsed, he said, his voice a low rumble. In the snow. The memory surfaced. The exhaustion. The soft, deadly white. She had failed. She was a burden. She closed her eyes. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, he said, his voice flat. Be alive. A strange, painful emotion welled up in her chest. She had fainted in the cold, and she had woken up. She had not been left. She had not been covered with snow and forgotten. A single tear, hot and sharp, escaped her closed eye and tracked into her hair. She whispered the words, not to him, but to the room, to the ghosts. No one ever came back for me before. Eli heard it. The words were so soft, so broken. They might have been the wind, but they landed on him like a stone. He had no answer for such a statement. He simply watched her as she slipped back into a more natural, healing sleep. They needed supplies. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world of blinding white and blue. But their flour and salt were low. The trip to Bitter Hollow was unavoidable. The town was even more pinched and judgmental than Helena remembered. The cold seemed to have soured every face. Eli had business with the blacksmith, leaving Helena with a short list and a small amount of coin at the general store. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, watched her as she gathered her items: salt, a small bag of beans, and thread. He tallied the items, his pencil scratching on a pad. That'll be $2.40. Helena's stomach tightened. I thought the salt was 50 cents and the beans $1. Prices go up with the snow, ma'am, he said, his eyes cold and flat. He was not calling her Mrs. Thatcher. That'll be $2.40. She knew, with a sick certainty, that he was lying. He was overcharging her because she was who she was. Because he could. She felt the familiar sting of shame, the hot flush of helplessness. She counted out the coins, her fingers clumsy in her mittens, and pushed them across the counter. She hurried out, clutching the small sack, and turned into the alley between the store and the smithy, a shortcut to the wagon. She was halfway down the alley when a man stepped out from behind a stack of barrels, blocking her path. He was a large man, with a thick neck and a reddish beard, smelling of wet wool and whiskey. She recognized him as one of the ranchers who had been in town on her first day, Silas Croft. Well now, he said, his voice oily. It's Thatcher's little shadow. Helena froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was the same script, a different actor. Please, she said, her voice a thread. Let me pass. In a hurry? He took a step closer. She could see the tobacco stains on his teeth. This cold getting to you? Thatcher's a cold man, lives in a cold place. Bet he wouldn't even miss a skinny little thing like you. He reached out, as if to touch her shawl. A woman needs a real man to keep her warm, not some hermit who'd rather talk to his horses. She was trapped. The old terror, the feeling of walls closing in, of a man's bulk and a man's will pressing down on her, made her stop breathing. You let her go. Silas. The voice was not loud. It was low, and it was final. Eli was standing at the mouth of the alley. He was not moving fast. He was a block of granite. Silas Croft laughed, a nervous, barking sound. Just talking. Thatcher, being neighborly. You're done talking, Eli said. He took 2 slow steps forward, placing himself directly between Helena and the other man. He did not look at Helena. His entire focus was on Croft. She's my wife, Eli said, the words dropping like ice into the snow. You ever speak to her again? You ever look at her again? You'll leave this town with fewer teeth, and you'll be pulling your own wagon. There was no bluster in the threat. It was a simple, factual statement of what would occur. Silas Croft, a bully who preyed on the weak, was no fool. He was looking at a man who was not weak and who was not afraid. He held his hands up, a false show of peace. No offense meant. Thatcher, just passing the time. He shuffled, trying to edge past them. Eli did not move. He stood, solid, until Croft was forced to press himself against the opposite wall, scraping his coat on the rough brick, to get by. When he was gone, the alley was silent, save for the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer. Helena was shaking so hard she could barely stand. The sack of beans fell from her numb fingers, spilling into the dirty snow. Eli did not speak. He knelt, calmly gathered the beans, and poured them back into the sack, snow and all. He stood, took her elbow with one hand and the sack with the other. "Let's go home," he said. The ride back was silent, but it was a different silence. Helena kept stealing glances at him. She had seen his quiet. She had seen his patience. She had just seen his rage. And it had been, for the first time in her life, on her behalf. It was a terrifying, powerful, and deeply confusing thing. The tension that had begun in the alley did not dissipate when they returned to the ranch. It settled between their two cabins, a living, humming thing. They were two people, alone on a mountain, bound by a piece of paper, and now, by a shared confrontation. The snows returned, and a full-scale blizzard descended. For 3 days, the world was a screaming whiteness. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, piling drifts as high as the cabin roofs. Helena's small cabin was vulnerable. The wind found every crack. She fed the stove constantly, but the cold was winning. On the third night, she fell into an exhausted sleep, and the fire died. She woke to a cold that was a physical pain. Her fingers and toes were numb. Her breath was a cloud in the blackness of the room. She could not feel her own face. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through her sleep-fogged mind. She knew, with an animal certainty, that if she stayed here, she would die. She would freeze in her cot, and Eli would find her in the morning. A block of ice. It was not a choice. It was survival. She fumbled in the dark, finding her thin blanket, and wrapped it around her. She pulled on her frozen boots, her fingers too numb to tie them. She opened her door. The wind tore it from her hand and slammed it against the wall. The world was a chaotic, roaring void of white. She lowered her head and plunged into it, fighting her way toward the one point of safety she knew. The 50 feet to his cabin felt like a mile. The snow was waist-deep, the wind trying to lift her, to steal her. She fell against his door, fumbling for the latch. She stumbled inside, a ghost covered in snow, and collapsed onto the floor, shivering too violently to speak. Eli was out of his cot in an instant, the big hunting knife he kept by his bed in his hand. He saw her, this snow-encrusted, half-frozen creature, huddled by his door. He did not ask questions. He sheathed the knife. He walked to his cot, where the buffalo robe was, and he simply lifted one side of it. It was an invitation. Helena, barely conscious, understood. She crawled from the floor, shedding her snow-caked blanket, and got under the robe. She was still in her damp clothes. She lay on the very edge of the cot, rigid, her back to him, her body shaking in violent, uncontrollable spasms. He lay down behind her, his own body rigid. They were a foot apart, two separate, cold islands under the same blanket. The hours passed. The wind shrieked. The cold from her damp clothes was seeping into the bed. Her shivering did not stop. Eli, his patience worn thin by the cold and the absurdity, let out a huffed breath. "This is foolishness," he growled, his voice muffled by the blanket. Before she could react, he moved. His large body shifted, pressing against her back. He was a wall of heat. He pulled her, unresisting, back against his chest, as one would spoon a child. He draped a heavy arm over her waist, pulling the robe tighter, and tucked her head under his chin. Helena went still. Her entire body was electrified. She was pressed, from her head to her knees, against this man. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her spine. "You're freezing," he muttered. "Go to sleep." She did not sleep, but her shivering, slowly, began to subside, wrapped in his heat, protected by his bulk. She listened to the wind howl, and for the first time in her life, she was not alone in the storm. Days later, the storm had passed, leaving the world scoured and silent. The incident was not spoken of. They had gone back to their separate cabins, the tension now so thick it was almost unbreathable. They were sharing a supper of stew in his cabin. The awkwardness was a third person at the table. The firelight played across his face, illuminating the old scar on his jaw. a puckered white line that ran from his cheekbone to his chin. She had stared at it for weeks. Now, she found her hand, her healed hand. Reaching out, it moved of its own accord, driven by a new, strange courage. She laid her fingers on his cheek. His beard was rough, his skin weathered. He went perfectly still, his spoon halfway to his mouth, his eyes locked on hers. Her fingers, trembling, traced the line of the scar. She was not just touching a wound. She was touching him. The man who had carried her. The man who had defended her. The man who had held her. Warm and safe. Through the blizzard. He stopped breathing. He caught her hand. His grip was not rough, but it was absolute. He pulled her hand from his face, turned it over, and pressed his lips to the pale, blue-veined skin of her wrist. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of reverence. It was a brand. Helena's breath hitched. It was the first gentle, deliberate touch she had ever known. A touch that was not a prelude to pain, but a thing in itself. A promise. He released her hand. Neither of them spoke. They had crossed a line, and neither knew what was on the other side. The next time he went to town, he went alone. When he returned, he had the usual sacks of flour and beans, but also a small, flat package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He tossed it onto the table in her cabin. "This is for you," he said, his voice gruff, as if it embarrassed him. He did not stay to watch her open it. Her fingers, still tingling from the memory of his kiss, fumbled with the string. Inside was a dress. It was made of plain, heavy wool, dyed a deep, simple blue. It was not a dress of fashion. It was a dress for a life. It was sturdy. It was whole. It was not patched. It was not a rag. Helena lifted it, the weight of the fabric heavy in her hands. She clutched it to her chest and the wall she had so carefully built around her heart, the wall that had survived beatings and starvation and grief, finally crumbled. She sank onto her cot and wept. It was not the silent, desperate crying of her first night. It was a storm, a deep, gut-wrenching, cleansing sob for the girl she had been, for the woman she had been forced to become, for the simple, profound gift of a new dress. When Eli returned, hours later, to bring her stew, she was still sitting there, her eyes red and swollen, the blue dress clutched in her lap. "It's just a dress. Helena," he said, alarmed, standing awkwardly in the doorway. She looked up at him, her face a mess of tears and gratitude. "I haven't," she whispered, her voice thick. "I haven't worn anything new since I was 13 years old." Eli's face softened. He stepped inside, took the bowl of stew, and set it on her stool. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "it's blue. I thought it might suit you." That night, she put on the blue dress. It was too large in the waist, but it was warm, and it was hers. To thank him, she was determined to cook a full dinner. She spent all afternoon. She followed the recipe in a tattered book she had found, for biscuits. She made a stew with a piece of dried beef. It was not a triumph. The biscuits were hard as stones, and the stew was thin. But when Eli walked into his cabin for supper, he stopped. She was there, at his table, which she had set with his 2 plates. She was wearing the blue dress, her hair combed back. The firelight made her skin glow. She looked, for the first time, like a woman, and not a ghost. He sat. He ate the hard biscuit without complaint. He ate the thin stew. "This is good, Helena," he said, his voice sincere. "Real good." A sound bubbled up from her chest. It was a rusty, creaking noise that surprised them both. It was a laugh. She had not laughed in years. "They're terrible," she said, laughing again, the sound cleaner this time. "The biscuits are rocks." He smiled, a real small smile that reached his eyes. "Well, they're honest rocks." He watched her, his gaze steady, and the hunger in his eyes was not for food. The air was thick with it. After they had cleaned up, they sat by the fire, a new, comfortable silence between them. The blue dress, his quiet compliment, her own laughter. It made her brave. She had to know. Eli, he looked up from the fire. Would you still want me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her hands twisting the new blue fabric in her lap. Here, with you, even if you knew the truth? About Pennsylvania, about why I really came. The question hung in the warm, firelit air. Eli was silent for a long time. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of shadow and light. He knew she was hiding something terrible. He could see the ghosts that rode her, but he also saw the woman who had laughed at her own hard biscuits, the woman who had traced his scar, the woman who had warmed his bed. You're here, Helena, he said finally, his voice low and certain. You're here, and you're surviving. That's all I need to know. He turned to look at her, his gaze holding hers. For now, his words hung in the air, a promise of acceptance. For now, it was not a threat, but an invitation, an opening. He had given her address. He had shared his warmth. He had defended her. He had given her everything but the one thing she was most afraid to offer in return, the truth. They sat by the fire in his cabin, as they often did now. The blizzard had broken, but the world outside was a frozen, silent white. She had moved her cot into the corner of his main cabin, a silent agreement that her own small, cold room was no longer safe or practical. They lived in this one room, orbiting each other, bound by unspoken words. She held her hands out to the blaze, the light catching the new wool of her blue dress. Eli, she said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the crackle of the logs. He looked up from the piece of harness he was mending. That man in town, Silas Croft, he called me a whore. Eli's hand stilled. He's a drunk, and he's a fool. He was right, she whispered. He said nothing. He just watched her, his face carved from shadow. Not in the way he meant. I never took money. She swallowed, the words thick and sour in her throat. But it's what they called me, back in Pennsylvania. She turned from the fire to look at him. His face was unreadable, but his gaze was steady. It did not waver. You said you worked as a maid, he said. It was not an accusation, just a statement. I did. Her hands began to twist in her lap. At the Braithwaite house, a big place with marble floors. I was 15 when I started. I worked hard. Mrs. Braithwaite said I was a good girl. She paused, the silence stretching. They had a son, Cyrus. The name was Ash in her mouth. He was older, 25, maybe. He had soft hands and a silver flask. He was always watching me. Eli set the piece of leather down. He did not move, but his entire body had become tense, a coiled spring. One night, I was told to bring him a pot of coffee. In the library. He locked the door. She stopped, the memory rising up. The smell of brandy and cigar smoke. The sound of his laugh. He forced me, she said, the words blunt and cold. He hurt me. She looked down at her hands. It happened more than once. I was too afraid to tell. Who would I tell? He was the master's son. I was a maid. After a few months, I knew I was in the family way. Eli's breath hitched, a tiny, sharp sound. When I couldn't hide it any longer, I begged Mrs. Braithwaite for help. I thought she was kind. Helena let out a small, bitter sound that was almost a laugh. She called me a harlot, a liar. She said I had tried to trap her son. She had me thrown out. That day, they dismissed me without a reference. No one would take me in. I had no family, no money. I walked until I couldn't. I found a shack, an old hunter's lean-to, miles from town. It was already snowing. I stayed there. I did what I could. I stole turnips from a field. I trapped a rabbit. Once. Her voice was fading, as if she were returning to that cold, dark place. The baby came, in the snow. She was rocking now, a small, unconscious movement. It was a girl. I think it was so dark. She looked at Eli, her eyes wide, haunted, seeing not him but the past. I held her. I tried to keep her warm. But I had no food, no fire. I was so cold. She cried, just for a few hours. Then she stopped. I buried her, under the snow, by a tall pine. I didn't have a shovel. I used my hands. I was going to lie down with her, to just stop. But then I don't know why. I didn't. I walked back to the town. I saw the advertisement for a mail-order bride. It said passage paid. I wanted to go west, where there was no one, where it was clean. She finished. The story was out, a small, dead thing in the space between them. She was shaking, but not from the cold. I am broken. Eli, I am not what you paid for. I am a whore and a mother who let her baby freeze. The cabin was utterly silent. The only sound was the fire. Eli Thatcher did not move for a long time. His face was a terrible mask of fury. His knuckles were white where he gripped the arms of his chair. He was, she realized, shaken. This man of rock and iron was shaken to his core. His rage was not for her. It was a black, consuming fire, and it was for the man with the soft hands, and for the woman who had turned her back. Slowly, as if it took a great effort, he uncurled his fists. He rose from his chair. He knelt before her. She flinched, pulling back, expecting a blow. It was the only reaction she had ever known from a man. After revealing a vulnerability, he stopped, his hand hovering in the air. Then, slowly, he offered it to her, palm up, a large, calloused, empty hand. She looked at it, confused. "Give me your hand. Helena!" His voice was rough, thick with an emotion she could not name, trembling. She placed her small hand in his. He closed his fingers around it, his grip warm and solid. He did not pull her. He just held her. He looked into her tear-filled eyes. "You're not broken," he said, his voice low and fierce. "You're still standing." He lifted her hand, the one he had bandaged, the one that had held her dying child, and he pressed his lips to her knuckles. It was not a kiss of passion, nor of pity. It was a kiss of reverence, an oath. The touch broke her, the simple, profound acceptance of it. She leaned forward, her other hand coming up to his face, to the rough beard, to the scar. "Eli," she breathed. He kissed her then. He rose, pulling her to her feet, and his mouth found hers. It was not like the first time, not the reverent press to her wrist. This was a kiss of sorrow, of anger, of shared pain. It was a kiss that said, "I see you. You are not alone." But her own restraint was gone. The wall of her past, which she had just torn down with her own words, was gone. She was raw, and she was, for the first time, seen. She broke the kiss, but only to press her face into the rough wool of his shirt, her hands fisting his collar. "Make me forget the cold," she whispered, her voice desperate. "Eli, please. Make me forget." He understood. It was not just the cold of the snow. It was the cold of the cellar, the cold of the alley, the cold of her baby's grave. He lifted her. She weighed nothing. He carried her the few steps to his cot, the one they now shared, and laid her down on the buffalo robes. The firelight danced over them. He did not rush. He was a man of infinite patience. He began to undress her, his large hands clumsy with the buttons of her new blue dress. When she was bare, he did not stare at her body, at its thinness, at the map of old bruises on her skin. He simply pulled back the robes, his own sheepskin coat, and the blankets, and covered her. He undressed himself in the shadows, and when he came to her, he was a mountain of warmth. He lay beside her, on top of the blankets, and just held her. She was rigid, a straight, terrified line of bone. "You're safe, Helena," he whispered, his lips against her hair. "You're with me. I won't hurt you." But when he finally moved to touch her as a husband, her body betrayed her. She flinched, a violent, involuntary recoil, a gasp tearing from her throat as she curled into herself. The past was with them, in the bed. Eli froze. He went utterly still. He did not sigh in frustration. He did not roll away in anger. He did not, as Cyrus had, pin her down. He pulled back. He rested on his elbows, looking down at her, his face full of a tenderness that was more painful, more beautiful, than anything she had ever known. He brushed the hair back from her face, his thumb stroking her temple. "It's just me," he whispered. "It's just Eli. You're home." He kissed her forehead. He kissed her eyelids. He kissed the scar on her chin. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble. "It's all right. We have time. We have all the time." He made no move to continue. He simply held her, shielding her, offering her his warmth with no demand. This patience, this absolute, profound gentleness, was her undoing. It was the thing that finally broke the terror. She looked at him, truly looked at him. This man who had defended her, who had accepted her shame, who was now holding her, asking for nothing. She was the one who moved. She uncurled, slowly, and her hand came up to rest on his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Don't stop," she whispered. This time, when he kissed her, she did not flinch. It was slow, and it was intense. It was an exploration. For him, it was an act of possession. For her, it was an act of reclamation. He was patient. His large, rough hands were a map of kindness on her skin. He whispered her name, over and over, not in praise of her body, but in praise of her. "Helena, my Helena." It was not the bruising, selfish, frantic act she had known. It was a conversation. It was a healing. When it was over, he did not roll away. He held her, his body wrapped around hers, her head on his chest, and she wept. She wept for the girl in the cellar. She wept for the baby in the snow. She wept for the years of cold. And she wept for the sheer, impossible, heartbreaking kindness of the man who held her. He said nothing. He just held her, stroking her hair, his own face buried in the scent of her, until her sobs quieted into sleep. She slept, for the first time, without nightmares, and she woke in the morning with her palm still pressed flat over his heart. In the weeks that followed, the ranch became a different place. The one-room cabin was no longer a refuge, but a home. They moved as a team, a quiet, practiced dance. They rose before dawn. He would build the fire, his movements silent in the dim light. She would make the coffee, strong and black, the way he liked it. They shared the chores, the lines of their duties blurring. He still chopped the wood, but she would be there to stack it. She still struggled with the pump, but he would often appear, his hand closing over hers on the frozen handle, and he would work it for her, their bodies close in the freezing air. He was breaking a new horse, a difficult roan, and Helena would watch from the porch, her heart in her throat. She was still learning to cook. The biscuits improved. They were no longer rocks, but, as Eli joked, merely stones. "One day, husband," she said, flicking a piece of flour at him, "I will make you a biscuit so light it will float away." He caught her hand, the floury one, and kissed the dust from her fingers. "I don't mind the stones," he said, his eyes smiling. "They build a man's character." Their touches became a language, a hand on the small of her back as they passed in the narrow cabin, his fingers brushing hers as he handed her a plate, her hand resting on his arm. As they sat by the fire, it was a constant, gentle reinforcement. "You are here, I am here. We are safe." Her Bible, the torn, water-stained book, had been her only companion for so long. Now, it became a bridge between them. "You never learned your letters?" she asked one evening, watching him try to decipher the label on a can of peaches. "No," he said, not ashamed. "My father said reading was for Easterners and preachers. Thomas, my brother, he learned, but I was always busy with the herd. I can teach you," she said softly. And so, by the light of a single kerosene lamp, she taught him. She started with the Bible. It was the only book she had. She would point to the words, her finger tracing the letters. Psalm 23, she said. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He would watch her, his gaze intense, and repeat the words. His progress was slow, his large, calloused fingers clumsy as he tried to form the letters on a piece of slate. One night, she found his notebook, the one he kept his tallies in. For feed and supplies, she opened it. And there, on a clean page, in his large, awkward, newly formed script, was her name. Helena. 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 He had written it over and over, filling the entire page. He was practicing it, learning it, claiming it. She ran her fingers over the letters, her heart so full it ached. He was practicing her name like a prayer. The spring was late, but it came. A slow greening of the high country. The snow receded, and the mud roads to Bitter Hollow became passable. They rode in on the buckboard, sitting close. It was her first trip to town since the confrontation with Silas Croft. The first since she had truly become Eli's wife. She felt different. She wore the blue dress, and she wore Eli's protection like a cloak. The town was the same. The gossip was still there. She could feel the eyes of the women in the general store, the whispers, the snickers, but they did not matter. She kept her head high. She stood by Eli's side. He was dealing with Mr. Henderson, his voice a low, firm rumble, questioning a charge for seed. Helena turned, a small, genuine smile on her face. Ready to go. And then she saw him. He was standing across the street, by the saloon, lighting a cigar. He was not a cowboy. He wore a dark, Eastern-style coat, tight trousers, and a hat that was all wrong for Montana. His face was clean-shaven, and he had a cruel, thin mouth. She had not seen him in 2 years, but she would have known him in hell. It was not Cyrus Braithwaite. It was his man, the one who had held her down, the one who had worked for her abuser, who had done his bidding. His name was Ames. The sack of flour she was holding slipped from her fingers. It hit the boardwalk with a dull thud. She made a small, strangled sound. Eli was at her side in an instant, his argument with Henderson forgotten. Helena, what is it? She could not speak. She could only point, her hands shaking violently. He followed her gaze. He saw the man in the dark coat, the man who was now looking at them, a slow, ugly smile of recognition spreading across his face. Who is he? Eli's voice was a low growl. His name is Ames, she whispered, her words trembling. He worked for Braithwaite. He knows me. Eli, he knows me. Her hand, which had been pointing, flew to Eli's sleeve, clutching him, her nails digging into his arm. The old fear, the one she thought she had conquered, was back, cold and sharp. The man, Ames, tipped his hat to her, a gesture of pure mockery. Then he turned, leisurely, and disappeared into the saloon. The ride home was silent. The fear sat between them. A cold, heavy passenger, the safety of the ranch, the intimacy of their cabin, felt 1,000 miles away. That night, the nightmares returned. She woke with a scream, thrashing in the cot, her hands fighting off a phantom. Eli had her, his arms around her, pinning her, saving her from herself. You're home! Helena, wake up! You're home! It's me! She collapsed against him, sobbing, her body slick with sweat. He's here, she cried. He found me. He'll tell them. He'll drag me back. No one is dragging you anywhere, Eli said, his voice a blade. He lit the lamp. His face was grim. We can go, he said, his voice practical. We can pack the wagon. We can go north, up to the high country, or west, Oregon. I don't care. We'll leave tonight. He was offering to abandon his home, the land his brother was buried on, for her. The magnitude of his offer, the sheer, solid weight of his protection, steadied her. It was a cold splash of water. She stopped crying. She looked at him, at his strong, worried face. And she saw, not the terrified girl who had arrived in rags, but the woman he had made her, his wife. No, she said, her voice shaking but firm. No, He took my past. Eli, he took my child. I will not let him take my home." She sat up, pulling the blanket around her. Her eyes, in the lamplight, were not filled with fear. They were filled with fire. "I don't want to hide anymore." Helena's resolve, spoken in the dark, lamplit cabin, was a fragile newborn thing. Eli's was not. His was iron, forged in a life of hardship and sharpened by her confession. He did not ride back to Bitter Hollow the next day. To go now would be to show their hand, to reveal their fear. He waited. He watched. He spent 2 days on the high ridges, his rifle across his lap, ostensibly checking his fences. He was not checking fences. He was mapping the approaches to his land. He was watching the single, winding trail from town. On the 3rd day, a lone rider, not the man Ames, came up the trail. It was Jebediah Stone, an old prospector who lived on the creek, coming to trade pelts for coffee. Eli met him on the trail, his face grim. "Jeb," Eli said, his voice low. There was a man in town, dark coat, eastern hat, staying at the saloon. Jeb, a man of few words and much observation, spat a stream of tobacco. "I saw him. Fancies himself a card sharp. Name's Ames. Asks a lot of questions." "What kind of questions?" "Asks about you. Thatcher. Asks about the woman you brought in. Asks if she's well settled." Jeb narrowed his eyes. He's got a sour look to him, like a man who enjoys another's pain. "Is he alone?" "He is, but he's spending freely, bragging on his boss, some rich fella back east, name of Braithwaite, says his boss owns half of Pennsylvania and is looking to own a piece of Montana." The confirmation was a cold stone in Helena's stomach when Eli retold the conversation. It was real. The shadow had followed her, and it had a name. Braithwaite. He was not just a memory. He was a man with money. A man who had sent his dog, Ames, to find her. That night, the quiet, shared intimacy of their cabin vanished. It was replaced by the taut, humming wire of tension. The ranch was no longer a home. It was a fortress, and a poorly defended one at that. "He knows where I am," Helena whispered, her hands twisting in the fabric of her blue dress. "He'll send word, and Cyrus will come." "Let him," Eli said. His voice was flat, but his eyes were alive with a cold fire. "This ain't Pennsylvania. There's no locked library doors here. This is my land." His preparations began immediately. He was no longer a rancher. He was a soldier. First, he brought out his arsenal. It was not large. His own Winchester rifle, the one that never left his side. His brother's old Colt revolver, which he strapped to his hip, a gesture that made Helena's heart ache, and a heavy, double-barreled shotgun. He pushed the shotgun into her hands. Helena recoiled, as if from a snake. "Eli, I've never—" "You will," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This ain't a request." He took her out behind the barn. He set up an old tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. "It's simple," he said, his voice all business. He stood behind her, his body a solid wall, his arms coming around her to position her hands. The intimacy of the gesture was lost in its grim purpose. "You brace it, here, against your shoulder, tight, or it'll break your collarbone. You sight down the barrel. You don't pull the trigger, you squeeze it." The shotgun was impossibly heavy. It smelled of oil and metal. "I can't," she whispered, her arms shaking. "You can," he said, his voice hard. "You can, or you can let him drag you back to Pennsylvania. That's the choice." The words hit her. A cold slap. She thought of Cyrus. She thought of Ames. She thought of the cold cellar. She set her jaw. She braced the stock. She sighted. "Now," he said. She squeezed. The explosion was deafening. The recoil was a brutal, physical blow that slammed her back into Eli's chest, knocking the air from her lungs. She cried out. The tin can was untouched. "Again," he said, his arm steadying her. "You flinched. Don't think. Just point. Again." For 2 hours, he made her shoot. At the can, at a knot on a tree, at a shadow. The smell of sulfur and powder filled the air. Her shoulder was a mass of purple bruises. Her ears rang, but she stopped flinching. She stopped crying out. She just loaded, aimed, and fired. When they were done, she was exhausted, her arms trembling. "He'll have a rifle," Eli said, taking the shotgun from her. "He'll be at a distance, but if he gets close, if I'm busy, you use this. You don't hesitate. You aim for the middle of him, and you'll pull both triggers. You understand?" "I understand," she said, her voice a hollow rasp. The tension in the cabin grew thick. Every sound was a threat. The scurry of a mouse in the walls made Helena jump, her hand flying to her throat. The wind, once a lonely comfort, was now a hiss with whispers. A knock at the door, which had once been a rare and welcome visit from Jebediah, now sent her diving for the shotgun. Eli, seeing her terror, would stop what he was doing, walk to her, and place his large hands on her shoulders. One night, she broke. He was barring the door, driving a new heavy wooden beam into place. She was watching him, her face pale in the lamplight. "You should send me away," she whispered. He stopped, the beam in his hands. He turned, slowly. "What did you say?" "It's me he wants. Ames, Braithwaite. It's my trouble. I brought it to you. You lost your brother. You can't, you shouldn't. You should tell me to go. I can walk. I can go to town. I can—" He crossed the room in 2 strides. He dropped the beam, the thud shaking the floor. He grabbed her, not gently. His hands were iron on her upper arms. He hauled her against his chest, his face a mask of dark, unreadable fury. He was so close she could feel the heat of him, the anger rolling off him in waves. He shook her, a single, sharp jolt. "Listen to me." She stared up at him, terrified. "There is no you and me. Not anymore. This is our land. This is our home. You think I don't know what trouble is? I buried my brother not 100 yards from where you're standing because of this land. You think I'm going to let some eastern thing come here and take my wife?" The words, "my wife," hit her with the force of a physical blow. "You're not trouble. Helena, you're everything." His grip softened, his thumbs stroking the bruised, shaking flesh of her arms. He pulled her closer, his anger fading into a desperate, aching tenderness. He buried his face in her hair. "You're my wife, Helena," he breathed, the words a vow against her skin. You stay, and we fight. That's the end of it." She wrapped her arms around his waist, clutching the rough fabric of his shirt, and held on, her fear finally giving way to the solid, unshakable bedrock of him. His words changed everything. The fear did not leave, but it no longer owned her. It was a shared burden. The next day, their preparations became a partnership. They were no longer a man preparing to defend a woman. They were 2 people preparing to defend their home. "He'll come at night," Eli said, his voice practical, as he studied the approaches to the cabin. "He'll try to use the shadows, but he doesn't know this land. I do." "The barn," Helena said, her own voice quiet but clear. "It's the only other cover. They'll use the barn." "Aye. We should dig." He looked at her. "In the war," she said. My father told me. They dug trenches, holes, to shoot from. So they weren't just standing." Eli stared at her, a slow, deep respect dawning in his eyes. This was not the broken, thin creature who had arrived in rags. This was a woman who had read, who had listened, who was thinking. "Show me," he said. For 3 days, they dug, not a trench, but a shooting pit, a shallow depression behind a low, natural stone wall that overlooked both the front of the cabin and the barn. It was hard, grueling work. The ground was still cold, the spring thaw only just beginning. She would break the ground with a pick, and he would shovel the heavy, rocky earth. Their teamwork was a new, desperate kind of intimacy. There was no room for romance, for the gentle touches of the past weeks. This was a grim, silent understanding. They would pass the spade, their hands brushing. They would share a canteen of water, their eyes meeting over the rim. Each glance was a promise. Each shovelful of dirt was a vow. They hid supplies. They cached a small bag with canteens, dried beef, and a box of shotgun shells in the woods, along a small creek that led up the mountain. "The North Ridge," Eli said, pointing. If the cabin falls, you run. You don't look back. You don't wait for me. You run, you follow this creek, and you don't stop until you hit the ridge. You wait there. If I'm not there by sunup, you go to Jeb's. You understand?" "I'm not leaving you," she said, her jaw set. "This ain't a discussion." "Helena!" he roared, his fear for her making him cruel. "This is a plan. You follow the plan. Swear it." She looked at him, her own eyes blazing. "I will follow the plan, but I'm not leaving you." The argument was left there, a jagged, unresolved thing between them. The morning he found the note, the world seemed to stop. He had gone to the barn before dawn, as was his custom. He returned to the cabin, his face gray. He held a piece of dirty parchment in his hand. Nailed to it was a single, dead raven. He dropped it on the table. Helena, who was stoking the fire, turned. The note was crude, written in charcoal. "She belongs back east, or you'll both burn." "The barn," Eli said, his voice a low, strangled sound. Nailed to the barn door. He had been in their space, while they slept, while they planned. He had been close enough to touch their lives, to leave his poison. Helena's old fear, the cold, stomach-churning terror, rose up. Her legs gave out. She sat, hard, on the stool. "He was here," she whispered. He was watching us." The thought of it, of Ames or Braithwaite himself, standing in the shadows, watching her, watching them. It was a violation that felt worse than the shooting. Eli's calm, however, was a thing to behold. His initial shock passed. His face settled into the carved lines of a man who had made a decision. He was done being hunted. He was a trapper, and the trap was now set. "Good," he said. Helena looked up, shocked. "Good?" "He's arrogant," Eli said, his voice a cold, flat calm that steadied her more than any reassurance. "He thinks he's a wolf, and we're sheep. He gave us a warning. That means he's coming soon. That means he's coming tonight." His strength was a wall she could lean against. She stood up, her own legs finding their power. "Then let him come." The day was spent in a tense, buzzing silence. They did not speak of what was to come. They spoke of small things. "The roan needs a new shoe," Eli said, cleaning his rifle for the third time. I'll make stew," Helena replied, her hands automatically measuring flour. But their bodies were alive with a different, desperate energy. Every time they passed, their hands brushed. Every look was a long, deep, desperate communication. "Are you here? I am here. I see you." As dusk fell, a purple and orange bruise on the horizon. Eli barred the door. He shuttered the windows. The cabin was plunged into a dim, firelit gloom. The air was electric. It was the last night, the end of the waiting. He turned to her. The stew was simmering, uneaten. The rifles were leaning against the wall. "Ready?" He looked at her, truly looked at her. At her face, pale in the firelight. At her hands, calloused now, twisting in the folds of her blue dress. At her eyes, wide with fear, but also with a fire that matched his own. He did not speak. He did not need to. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. It was not gentle. It was not a kiss of reverence or of comfort. It was a kiss of desperation, a kiss of defiance. It was a raw, fierce, desperate claiming. "You are mine. I am yours. We are alive." He tore the blue dress from her, the sound of the ripping fabric a counterpoint to the howl of the rising wind. He carried her to the cot, and they made love as if it were their last act on earth. It was not a healing. It was a fire. It was fierce, and it was desperate. A union against the storm. A final, wordless promise that they would not be broken. They were two living, breathing, fighting souls. and they were claiming this last, desperate moment of life before the darkness. After, they lay tangled in the furs, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The fire had burned down to embers. "Eli," she whispered. "I'm here. I'm not afraid." It was a lie, but it was a beautiful one. "I am," he said, his voice raw. "But it don't matter. We stand." The moon was high and cold when the sound came, a single, sharp crack of a dry twig. Eli was on his feet in an instant, pulling on his trousers, the Colt revolver already in his hand. "They're here," he whispered. He didn't have to say it. Helena was already pulling on her own clothes, her hands fumbling with the shotgun shells. "The pit," he said. He unbarred the door. The night air was bitingly cold. They moved, shadows among shadows, slipping from the cabin to the shallow trench they had dug behind the stone wall. They lay flat, the cold, damp earth seeping into their clothes. The moon was a curse, illuminating the clearing in a pale, ghostly light. For an hour, nothing, just the wind. Helena was shaking, her teeth chattering so hard she had to bite her lip. "Steady," Eli whispered, his hand finding hers in the dark. His skin was warm. Then a shadow detached itself from the barn, and another, and a third, larger shadow, emerging from the trees at the edge of the clearing. "3," Eli breathed. "Just like I figured." The 3 men advanced, spread out and moving toward the dark, silent cabin. They thought it was an execution. They thought their prey was asleep. The man in the center, the large one, was Braithwaite. Helena knew it, in her bones. The arrogance of him. The one on the right, skittering from cover to cover, was Ames. "I'll take the one on the left," Eli whispered. "You take the one on the right, Ames, the one I told you. You aim, you wait for my shot, then you fire. Eli, you can do this. You're a Thatcher. You fight." The men were in the middle of the yard, 20 yards from the cabin. "They're going to try and burn us out," Eli muttered. "They've got oil." Braithwaite, the leader, stopped. He raised his hand. He pointed at the cabin door. Ames, the man from the saloon, ran forward, a torch and a can in his hand. "Now," Eli said. His rifle shot was a single, clean, deafening crack. The man on the left, the third hired man, crumpled, his own rifle discharging into the dirt. For a second, there was a stunned, perfect silence. Then, chaos. "Get her!" Braithwaite roared, diving behind the woodpile. Ames, dropping the torch, raised his pistol and fired wildly at the cabin. "Now, Helena!" Eli yelled. Helena rose from the pit, the world slowing down. She saw the flash of Ames's pistol. She saw the man who had held her down. She smelled the sulfur. She raised the shotgun. She did not aim. She pointed, just as Eli had taught her. She pointed at the center of him, and she pulled both triggers. The force of the blast threw her backward. The noise was a physical thing. Ames screamed, a high, wet, terrible sound. He was not dead, but his right side, his arm, his chest, was a ruin. He fell, writhing, in the dirt. "In the cabin!" Eli roared, grabbing her, pulling her up. "Reload!" They scrambled from the pit as a rifle shot splintered the stone wall where they had been. "Braithwaite!" They fell through the cabin door, Eli barring it. "You did it, girl!" he panted, his eyes wild, grabbing her, kissing her. A hard, powder-stained kiss. "You did it! He was grazed!" His left arm, a dark, wet stain was spreading down his sleeve. "Eli, you're hit!" "It's nothing," he yelled, shoving his rifle through the firing port he had cut in the wall. "He's still out there, by the woodpile!" Another shot. The bullet ripped through the plank wall, inches from Helena's head. "Helena, reload!" She was fumbling with the shells, her hands shaking so hard she could barely fit them in the breech. "He's moving!" Eli shouted, firing into the darkness. And then, the one thing he had not planned for. A heavy crash from the back door. Braithwaite had circled. The heavy beam Eli had barred it withheld, but he was chopping at it, an axe biting deep. "The shotgun," Eli said, his voice deadly calm. He handed her the Colt. "Stay by the front. If he comes, You know what to do." He picked up his own axe. He stood by the back door, waiting. The wood splintered. The door burst open. Cyrus Braithwaite stood there. He was a large man, but soft. His face was contorted with rage. "Where is she?" he screamed. Eli didn't speak. He swung the axe, but Braithwaite was expecting it. He fired his pistol. The shot went wide. Eli's axe bit deep into the doorframe. Braithwaite lunged, not at Eli, but past him. He had seen her. He was a madman. He backhanded Helena, sending her flying, the colt skittering across the floor. "You whore!" he screamed, his face purple. "You thing! You'll pay for that man! You'll pay for everything!" Eli was on him, a primal roar tearing from his chest. They crashed to the floor. Two beasts, biting, punching, gouging. Braithwaite was bigger, softer, but fueled by a mad rage. He kneed Eli in the ribs. He got on top, his thumbs finding Eli's throat. "I'll kill you first," he choked. Helena scrambled. She was by the fireplace, the pitchfork, the small one, for the hay. She grabbed it. Braithwaite was choking the life from her husband. His back was to her. "Get out, Helena." Eli choked, his face turning blue. Helena screamed. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of 1,000 years of rage. It was the scream of the girl in the cellar. It was the scream of the mother in the snow. She lunged, plunging the pitchfork with all her strength into Braithwaite's back. The man arched, a sound of pained surprise. She pulled it out and stabbed him again. "I'm not yours." Braithwaite rolled off Eli, his hands pawing at his back. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a final, confused understanding. He collapsed. The cabin was silent. Nothing but the sound of Eli, gasping for air. The front door was kicked open. Helena spun, raising the pitchfork, ready to kill again. Sheriff Brody stood there, his own gun drawn. 2 deputies behind him. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," the sheriff whispered, taking in the scene. The body of Braithwaite. Eli, bleeding and gasping on the floor. Helena, her blue dress torn, her face smeared with soot and blood, holding a pitchfork. And outside, the sounds of his deputies finding Ames, moaning, and the third man, dead. Eli got to his knees. He crawled to Helena. He wrapped his one good arm around her legs. It's over," he choked. He looked up at the sheriff. "He came for my wife. Sheriff, he came to kill us. He brought hired men. You'll find the man she shot. Ames. He'll talk." Braithwaite, on the floor, gave one last, wet cough. He was not dead. He looked at Helena, his eyes burning with a terrible, final hatred. "This ain't over," he spat, a bubble of blood on his lips. See, you hang." Then he went still. The sheriff, his face grim, holstered his weapon. He knelt by Ames, who was crying outside, then came back. "We got him. Thatcher," he said. He looked at the note on the table. "The dead Raven." He looked at the fortified cabin. He'll be tried," the sheriff said. "Arrest him." Eli panted, as a deputy cuffed the groaning, wounded Ames. "Arrest them both." The deputies carried Braithwaite out, his legs dragging. He was alive. "I'll be back," Eli said, his voice flat. "To give my testimony." The sheriff nodded and left. Eli and Helena were alone, in the wreckage of their home, surrounded by the smell of blood and powder. She dropped the pitchfork. She fell to her knees, and finally, began to shake. Eli pulled her in, his good arm holding her, his head pressed to hers. "It's over," he whispered. You're safe. The morning after was a thing of terrible, aching silence. The sun rose on a yard scarred by the fight, stained with blood and powder. The air was sharp with the smell of spent shells. Eli and Helena moved like ghosts, cleaning the wreckage of their home. The sheriff and his deputies had taken Braithwaite, Ames, and the body of the third man hours ago. Before dawn, Braithwaite had been alive. his curses a low, venomous stream until he was out of earshot. Now, there was only the work. Helena found the pitchfork, still dark with Braithwaite's blood, and scrubbed it at the pump, her hands shaking until the water ran clear. Eli? His left arm bound in a tight sling she had fashioned from a torn sheet, his ribs a bruised agony, methodically patched the splintered holes in the cabin walls and the back door. They did not speak. There were no words for what had passed between them, for what they had done. Eli's wound was a long, bloody graze along his forearm. The bullet had torn the flesh but missed the bone. She had cleaned it with whiskey, her touch tender, her face pale. He had not flinched, his eyes on hers, a silent, shared acknowledgement of the lines they had crossed. They buried the dead raven. Eli simply took the parchment with its threatening note, the grim feathered talisman, and threw it into the stove. He watched it curl into black ash, his face a mask of cold iron. 3 days later, a deputy rode up the trail. He was a young man, and he looked at Helena with a kind of nervous awe. He held out a folded paper. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Mrs. Thatcher, this is a summons. From Judge Parker, the circuit judge. He's in Bitter Hollow. He's calling a court." Helena's hand, the one reaching for the paper, froze. "A summons?" Eli's voice was a low growl from the porch. He stepped forward, his good arm moving to rest on Helena's shoulder. "Yes, sir, Mr. Thatcher. For both of you, but mostly for her, to testify about Mr. Braithwaite and Mr. Ames." The deputy shuffled. "The trial's set for 2 days from now." "We'll be there," Eli said. The deputy, visibly relieved, nodded and rode away quickly. Helena unfolded the paper. Her name, Helena Thatcher. I have to," she whispered. The old fear, the one she thought had been burned away by gunfire, returning as a cold, sick dread. Eli corrected her. "We will be there. But, Eli, the town, they'll look at me. They'll blame me." "Let 'em look," Eli said, his voice flat. He turned her to face him, his one good hand gripping her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You stood your ground. Helena, you fought. Now you'll speak. I'm not asking. I'm telling you, you'll speak. And I'll be right there." The town of Bitter Hollow was humming. The news of the shootout at the Thatcher Ranch had spread like a wildfire, consuming every other piece of gossip. The arrival of a circuit judge, a man who held the power of life and death, had turned the small, dusty settlement into a hive of nervous energy. And the town had, indeed, divided. As Eli and Helena rode in on the buckboard, the whispers were a physical, palpable thing. "That's her," a woman muttered, pulling her child close as Helena passed the mercantile. "The one from the east, the mail-order bride. Brought it on herself. I heard," Mr. Henderson said from his doorway, his arms crossed. "Brought her corruption here, Eastern corruption. We never had this kind of trouble till she arrived." Silas Croft, nursing a beer on the saloon porch, sneered. "Knew she was bad luck. Thatcher should have left her in the snow." But there was a new, different sound. Mrs. Brody, the sheriff's wife, stood on her own porch. She did not whisper. She looked at Helena, at her pale, set face, and she gave a small, firm nod. A nod of respect. And in the crowd, other women watched. They did not sneer. They watched with a new, fearful, and curious intensity. They watched the way Eli, his arm in a sling, his face a grim mask, helped his wife from the wagon, his hand possessive on the small of her back, his gaze daring any man to speak. The trial was held in the saloon. It was the only room large enough. The tables had been pushed back, the bar covered in a canvas sheet. The air was thick, smelling of sawdust, stale beer, and the sweat of too many anxious bodies. Judge Parker was a large man with a beard like a spade and eyes that missed nothing. He sat at a simple pine table, a gavel in his hand. The room was packed. The entire town was there. Braithwaite was seated at a table. He was cleaned up, wearing an expensive, dark suit. His arm was in a sling, his face pale, But his arrogance had returned. He looked at Helena as she entered, his eyes full of a cold, proprietary hatred. Beside him, Ames, his right sleeve empty and pinned to his shirt, his face gray and broken, stared at the floor. "The court calls Helena Thatcher." The judge's voice boomed. Helena's legs felt like water. Her hands were ice. Eli, who had insisted on a chair beside her, squeezed her hand. "You're still standin'," he whispered, his voice a low rumble just for her. She stood. She walked to the front, the sound of her own worn boots on the wooden floor the loudest sound she had ever heard. She wore the blue dress Eli had given her. It had been torn in the fight, and she had mended it, the stitches small and tight and angry. She took the oath, her hand on a Bible. "Mrs. Thatcher," the judge said, his voice not unkind, "this court has heard testimony from Sheriff Brody. It has heard the confession of the man, Ames, who seems to believe he will get a lighter sentence for it. Now, it needs to hear from you, in your own words. Why did this man," he pointed the gavel at Braithwaite, "come to your home and try to kill you?" Braithwaite's lawyer, an expensive man from Helena, stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The question is leading and assumes a crime. Overruled," Judge Parker snapped. "Sit down. Counselor, this ain't Helena. This is Montana. Let the woman speak." Helena stood, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked at the judge. She looked at the silent, watching faces of the town, the women who had scorned her, the men who had mocked her. And she looked at Eli. He was watching her, his face carved from stone, his eyes burning with a pride that was so fierce it gave her breath. She turned to the judge. Her body was shaking, but her voice, when it came, was clear and cold and did not falter. "My name is Helena," she began, her voice low, but it carried in the packed, silent room. "Before I was Helena Thatcher, I was a maid in Pennsylvania at the home of Mr. Cyrus Braithwaite." She recounted it all. She spoke of the locked library door, of the smell of his brandy, of the violence that was not a fight, but a simple, brutal act of possession. The room was so quiet. The buzz of a fly by the window was an intrusion. She spoke of the dismissal, of Mrs. Braithwaite calling her a harlot, of being thrown into the street, pregnant, with no reference and no coin. "Eastern corruption," she said, her eyes finding Mr. Henderson in the crowd. "That is what you called it. And you were right. It followed me here." She spoke of the shack. She spoke of the snow. And then she spoke of her baby. She was a girl, I think. It was so dark. Her voice cracked, just once, a tiny fissure in her armor. I held her. I tried to keep her warm, but I had no food, no fire. She cried for a few hours, and then she stopped. In the gallery, a woman's sob broke the silence. It was Mrs. Henderson. Her hand was over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Then another woman, Mrs. Brody. They were weeping, silently, their faces wet with tears. The men looked at their boots, their faces red, their own wives' faces, a mirror of sudden, terrible understanding. "I buried her with my hands," Helena said, her voice flat. All emotion burned out of it. "And I walked away. I came west to be clean, to be left alone." She turned, then, and looked at Cyrus Braithwaite. He was no longer sneering. He was staring at her, his face a mask of pale, stunned fury. He had not expected this. He had expected a cowering, silent, broken thing. "He sent that man, Ames, to find me," she said, pointing. "Not to bring me back, but because I was his, because I had escaped. He came to my home. He brought hired men. He threatened to burn us. He tried to kill my husband." She looked back at the judge. I did what I had to. I fought. We fought for our home, for my life." She was done. She stood, shaking, but upright. The silence in the room was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Judge Parker looked at Helena for a long, long time. He looked at the weeping women in the gallery. He looked at Eli Thatcher, whose face was a mask of such terrible, controlled rage that the judge was glad the man's arm was in a sling. Finally, he turned his gaze to Cyrus Braithwaite. "Mr. Braithwaite," the judge said, his voice dangerously soft. "You have come a long way. You have brought your Eastern ways to my territory. You have brought your hired guns. You have brought your corruption." "This is an outrage," Braithwaite's lawyer shouted, leaping to his feet. "This is hearsay, a woman's hysterical fantasy." "Aim! Silence!" the judge roared, his gavel slamming down with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. "I have the confession of your other man, Ames, who has given up his employer to save his own miserable skin. I have the threatening note. I have the testimony of a woman who, God help her, has lived a life that would have broken any man in this room." He stood. "Cyrus Braithwaite, you are found guilty. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of attempted murder. Guilty of a moral sickness that has no place here." "You can't," Braithwaite screamed, his arrogance finally cracking, revealing the pale, weak man beneath. "You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Judge Parker said, his voice like ice. "You're a man who is going to prison. I sentence you to 25 years of hard labor in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge." A gasp went through the room. 25 years. It was a death sentence. "And you, Mr. Ames," the judge said, "for your cowardly but useful confession, 15 years. Get them out of my sight." Braithwaite lunged, his face purple, screaming, "I'll see you hang, you bitch! I'll see you all hang!" The deputies, including Sheriff Brody himself, wrestled him from the room, his threats echoing until the heavy saloon doors slammed shut. Helena almost collapsed. Eli was there, his good arm around her, holding her up. The room began to empty, the townspeople filing out, silent, their faces pale. As Helena and Eli walked out into the bright, harsh sunlight, the crowd on the boardwalk parted for them. No one sneered, no one whispered. Mrs. Henderson, her eyes still red, stepped forward. She was holding a large roll of dark blue, sturdy wool fabric. "Mrs. Thatcher," she said, her voice thick. She pushed the fabric into Helena's arms. For the trouble, for your dress." Helena, stunned, could only nod. Then Silas Croft, the rancher who had cornered her, was standing there, his hat in his hands, his face bright red. "Ma'am," he mumbled, looking at his boots. "Mr. Thatcher, I'm a fool." Eli just stared at him, his face hard, until the man shuffled away in shame. Helena walked beside her husband, her head held high, the roll of new fabric clutched to her chest. She found herself less afraid to walk in the daylight. She found herself, for the first time, breathing. The ride back to the ranch was long, and it was quiet, but it was not the tense, frightened silence of before. It was the deep, exhausted, healing silence of a war's end. Spring had truly come. The snow was gone from all but the highest, shadowed peaks. The air was warm, sweet with the smell of pine sap and damp earth. The aspens were covered in new, pale green leaves that trembled in the breeze. They sat on the porch of their repaired cabin, watching the sunset, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Eli had been quiet for an hour. He was holding a small, round tin in his good hand, rubbing his thumb over the lid. "Helena," he said, his voice low. She turned, a small, tired smile on her face. "I'm here, Eli." He looked at her, his eyes full of an emotion so deep, so raw, it made her heart ache. "The preacher, the one who married us, he did it by the book. You're my wife, in the eyes of the law, and you were my wife. In that courtroom," he opened the small, worn tin. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, thin, simple ring of gold. This was my mother's. She wore it every day. She died with it on. He took the ring from the box. I asked you to be my wife because I needed help, because I was alone. That was a practical thing. Helena, it was a bargain. He took her left hand, his calloused thumb tracing the pale, healed skin. But that's not what this is, not anymore. He looked up, his gaze locking with hers. Let's make it real, he whispered, his voice thick. He slid the thin, worn gold band onto her finger. It was warm from his hand. It fit perfectly. Helena Thatcher, he said, testing the name, a slow, rare smile touching his lips. I love you, and I want to marry you. Not for the ranch, not for the law, for me, for you. They were married 3 weeks later, when the circuit preacher, a thin, earnest man named Mr. Gideon, made his way back through the valley. It was a small, quiet wedding. Eli had asked him to ride out. Their church was the sky. Their witnesses were the mountains. Eli had invited Jebediah Stone, the old prospector, who showed up in a clean shirt, his beard trimmed, and stood as Eli's man. They stood under the largest cottonwood tree, the one by the creek, its new spring leaves a vibrant, trembling green. Eli was in his best shirt, his arm free of the sling, though he still favored his ribs. Helena wore the blue dress he had given her, the mended one, and on her feet. She wore nothing. She wanted to feel the new, clean grass beneath her. She felt, for the first time, rooted to this land. The preacher's words were a low, steady rumble, a counterpoint to the rush of the creek and the sigh of the wind. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here, in the sight of God. Eli's eyes never left her face. He saw not the rags, not the bruises, not the fear. He saw the woman who had fought beside him, the woman who had taught him to read, the woman who had laughed at her own hard biscuits. To join this man and this woman in holy matrimony? Helena looked at him, at this impossible, steady, quiet man who had given her back her life. Her heart was so full, it felt as if it might burst. If any man can show just cause, she could not wait. Before the preacher could get to the end, before he could say, "You may kiss the bride." Helena rose on her bare toes, grabbed the front of Eli's shirt with both hands, and pulled him down. She kissed him. It was not a kiss of fear, or of desperation, or of passion. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated joy, a kiss of choice, a kiss that sealed not a bargain, but a vow. Eli, stunned, laughed into the kiss, his arms wrapping around her, lifting her off the ground. Jebediah Stone clapped, a single, loud, approving sound. Mr. Gideon, the preacher, coughed, a small, scandalized, but ultimately happy sound. Well, then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife, again. That night, the cabin was transformed. Eli had spent the day cleaning. The bullet holes were patched and sanded. The floors were swept, and he had used a month's savings to buy candles. The room was lit by a dozen small, flickering flames. It was bathed in a soft, warm, golden light. They did not speak. Words, for now, were done. He came to her, where she stood by the window, the gold ring on her finger a heavy, warm weight. He kissed her forehead. He undressed her, slowly, not with the fierce, desperate hunger of the night before the fight, but with a slow, wordless reverence. He unbuttoned the mended blue dress, his rough, gentle fingers brushing her skin. She undressed him, her own hands tracing the puckered scar of the bullet graze on his arm, the deep, fading bruises on his ribs. His body was a map of their survival. They came to their bed, the cot now a marriage bed, wrapped in candlelight and the sound of the wind. He laid her down, and he looked at her, his eyes saying everything his mouth could not. This was the vow. It was slow, and it was quiet. It was not about forgetting the pain. The scars were still there. The ghosts of the cellar and of the snow would always be there. But this was a choice. It was a choice to build a new life, a real life. On the foundations of the old, it was a choice to find joy, even after all the sorrow. It was a choice to be warm, after a lifetime of being cold. He wrapped his body around hers, and in the quiet, flickering light of their small, safe home, he whispered her name, over and over, like a prayer, and she, for the first time, felt truly and completely home. The spring that followed their wedding was a revelation. It was not just a thaw, it was a birth. The valley, which Helena had first seen as a place of brutal, cold emptiness, exploded into a riot of life. The creeks were loud with meltwater, the aspens uncurled leaves so green they looked like new minted coins. The high meadows were a carpet of Indian paintbrush and bluebells. And as the land healed, so did they. Months passed, and the rhythms of their lives settled. The fear of the past, the shadow of Braithwaite, did not vanish, but it wrecked. Word came from Judge Parker that Braithwaite was in Deer Lodge, his appeals exhausted, his power broken. The name ceased to be a threat and became a scar, a puckered, ugly mark that was part of them, but no longer a fresh wound. Life took over. Their one-room cabin, once a refuge, then a fortress, now became a home. It was too small, but it was full. Helena found her place, not just on the ranch, but in the valley. Her testimony, the raw, terrible honesty of it, had changed how the town saw her. She was no longer the mail-order shadow. She was Thatcher's wife, and the title was spoken with a new, grudging, and then genuine respect. The fabric Mrs. Henderson had given her became 2 new dresses and a shirt for Eli. When she came to the mercantile to pay, Mr. Henderson, his face still red, refused her coin. It's credit, ma'am, on the house, for the trouble. She had learned to read, and so she became a conduit for the words of others. Women in the valley, wives of ranchers and miners who had never learned their letters, began to come to her. They would ride for hours, bringing a child with a fever or a basket of eggs, and they would sit at her table. My sister, in Ohio. One woman, Mrs. Gable, a hard-faced woman with kind eyes, said, her hands twisting, I ain't spoken to her in 6 years. Could you? And Helena would write. She would listen to the clumsy, heartfelt, unspoken words and translate them onto paper. Dear Sarah, the winter was hard. The new calf is strong. I miss the sound of your laugh. She wrote of births and deaths and the simple, hard news of their lives. She became the valley's voice, its memory. She bought a hive of bees from Jebediah and learned their sweet, humming language. She planted a garden, a large, ambitious one, and the vegetables that grew from the rich, dark earth were a daily miracle. Eli, in turn, built. He was a man who spoke with his hands, and his hands were now building a life. He repaired every fence, not just as a chore, but as an act of delineation, marking their land. He broke new horses, his patience and quiet strength a language the animals understood, and one day she came out to find him working on a strange, angled frame of wood against the south-facing wall of the cabin. What is it?" she asked. He did not look up, his face set in concentration as he planed a piece of wood. "You said the tomatoes get the frost." She had said it, months ago, a casual complaint. "Eli," he set the plane down. "Jeb said, in town, there was a man, sold him glass, for windows. I traded the pelts. It was a greenhouse. A small, strange, beautiful lean-to, built of scrap lumber and, in a few weeks, filled with 6 panes of precious, wavy glass. It was a place for her things to grow, safe from the cold. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was a poem, written in wood and glass. Their love deepened, not into a fiery passion, but into a thing that was far stronger. An oak. It was not perfect. They were not perfect. They were 2 scarred people, living in a small room. He was still quiet, and prone to a darkness she could not reach. She was still, sometimes, a visitor in her own life, but it was enduring. The nightmares, her old, dark companions, still came, the cellar door, the man's belt buckle, the thin, wailing cry. She would wake with a gasp, her heart hammering, her hands clenched. But now, she did not wake alone. He would be there, his solid, warm presence in the bed. He would not speak. He would not offer platitudes. He would simply turn, his one good arm coming around her, and pull her back against his chest. He would hold her, his hand over her heart, until its frantic beat slowed to match his own. Steady and sure. I am here. And he had his own ghosts. The bullet wound in his arm had healed, but his ribs, where Braithwaite had kicked him, ached when the cold came down. He would limp, sometimes. A subtle hitch in his strong stride. She would see it, and at night, by the fire, she would not ask, she would not press. She would simply kneel, taking his foot in her lap, and she would rub his legs. Her small, strong hands would work the muscle, easing the tension, her silence a perfect match for his. Her touch was not a question, it was an answer. The summer was long and green. The autumn was gold and sharp. Visitors came. Sheriff Brody, no longer a bearer of summons, but a man stopping for coffee. He looked at Helena, his gaze respectful, and talked to Eli about cattle prices. Jebediah Stone came and sat on their porch and taught Helena which mushrooms were safe and which would kill you, and the women, Mrs. Gable and others. They came, and they sat, and they talked. And Helena, their scribe, their center, felt a warmth that was not from the stove. It was in the fall, when the aspens were a river of gold, that Helena knew. The feeling was not new. It was a familiar, cold dread. Her monthly flow, always scant, had stopped. Her body, which she had reclaimed, felt alien. She was pregnant. The realization did not bring joy. It brought a cold, sharp, visceral terror. She was standing at the new greenhouse, staring at a dead tomato vine, when the sickness rose in her throat. All she could see was the snow, the dark, cold shack, the thin, weak cry, the feeling of her own hands, raw and bleeding, digging a small, shallow hole in the frozen earth. History. Repeating. She fled. She ran from the cabin, from the smell of coffee and wood smoke, from the comfort of her new life. She ran to the creek, the one where they had stood, under the cottonwood. She was sick in the bushes, and then she fell to her knees, her whole body shaking. "No," she whispered, her hands on her stomach. "No, please, not again." She was terrified. Terrified of the child. Terrified of the birth. But most of all, terrified of the loss. She had survived one. She could not, would not, survive another. She did not know how long she was there. An hour, maybe 2. She felt his presence before she saw him. Eli. He was just standing there, 10 feet away, his hat in his hands. He had not followed her. He had tracked her. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not ask why she was crying. He just walked over, his face etched with a deep, worried tenderness. He knelt in the mud in front of her. His knees were in the dirt. "Helena," he asked, his voice a low, rough thing. I can't," she sobbed, the words torn from her. "Eli, I can't." "Can't what?" I'm with child." She said it like a death sentence. She waited for him to be, what, practical, angry? She waited for him to talk about another mouth to feed, about the winter. He did not. He looked at her terrified, tear-streaked face, and his own face broke, a slow, stunned, unbelievable smile, a smile of such pure, unadulterated joy. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds. He was happy. I lost her," Helena choked out, desperate to make him understand. "In the snow. I will lose this one, too. I can't." Eli's smile faded, not into anger, but into a deep, profound understanding. He saw her fear, her past, her ghost. He did not try to argue with her. He did not offer platitudes. He simply reached out, his large, calloused hands, and he placed them, gently, on her stomach. He held her, his thumbs rubbing small circles. Then he leaned forward, and he pressed his lips, his rough, bearded mouth, to her belly, right over her hands. He kissed the child, he kissed her. He looked up. His eyes, those quiet, steady eyes, were wet. "You won't lose this one," he said, his voice a vow, a promise so fierce it was a force of nature. "I'm here. You're here." He met her gaze, and he sealed his promise. "We'll make it right this time." The winter came, and it was a harsh one. The snows fell early, and they fell deep, but the cabin was warm. Eli had caulked every crack. They had a mountain of firewood. They had sacks of flour and beans and shelves of Helena's canned vegetables from her garden. Helena's body grew. She was no longer thin. She was round, and, for the first time in her life, she was not hungry. She was healthy. Eli treated her as if she were made of thin glass, but a strong wind. His hands always ready to steady her, his eyes always watching. Her fear did not leave, but it quieted. It became a small, manageable thing, living alongside a new, fragile hope. In February, the worst of the blizzards hit, a whiteout that lasted 3 days. The world was a screaming, white void. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The silence was deafening. "A calf," Eli said, pulling on his heavy coat. "The new one, the red one. She's not with her mother. I think she broke the fence, got lost in the drift." "Eli, no," Helena said, her hand on her belly, her fear a sharp spike. It's just one calf. Let it go. It's too cold." "It's not just a calf," he said, his face set. It's ours. I have to look." He kissed her. "I won't be long. I'll stay close to the creek." He left. She watched him from the window, his broad back, until he was a small, dark speck, and then he was gone, swallowed by the endless white. An hour passed. The sun was a pale, weak disk. 2 hours. The stew she had been warming on the stove began to stick. She felt it. A cold, sharp, animal panic. The same panic she had felt, running from her greenhouse. He was too long. She pulled on her own coat, the one he had bought her, and her boots. She wrapped a scarf around her face. She took the shotgun. "Eli!" she screamed, from the porch. Her voice was gone, stolen by the wind and the vast, cold silence. "Eli!" She was not a victim. She was not a girl in a cold shack. She was Helena Thatcher, and she was going to find her husband. She followed his tracks. They were already fading, the wind scouring them. She followed them down to the creek, and then they vanished. The wind had taken them. "Eli!" she screamed, her voice raw with terror. She stumbled, her heavy body a burden. She fell, landing hard in a deep drift. "No!" she panted, her own hot breath freezing on her scarf. "No!" And then she saw it, a piece of his red scarf, tied to a low branch. He had left her a sign. She followed it, and another. He had been smart. And then she found him. He was in a ravine, not far from the creek. He had fallen. The snow had given way. He was not moving. The calf, the small, stupid, red calf, was standing beside him, bawling. "Eli!" She half ran, half fell down the slope. He was alive. His leg, it was twisted at a bad angle. His face was pale, his lips blue. He was unconscious. "Don't you dare!" she whispered, her voice a low, furious hiss. "Don't you dare leave me!" She was not the girl who had collapsed in the snow. She was a fury. She could not lift him. He was a mountain of a man. She grabbed his good arm. She put her arms under his, and she dragged him, step by agonizing step, out of the ravine. The calf, loyal, followed. She dragged him, 100 yards at a time. Then she would stop, catch her breath, her own body screaming, the child inside her a heavy, protesting weight. She dragged him over the snow, his body a dead weight. It took her 2 hours. 2 hours of pulling, of sobbing, of cursing his name, and God's, and the calf's. She got him to the cabin. She got him inside, onto the floor, in front of the stove. He was barely breathing. His skin was like ice. She did not panic. She was a woman of pure, focused, primal rage. She tore his clothes from him. His frozen coat, his shirt, his trousers. Her hands, clumsy with cold and fear, ripping the fabric. She stripped herself, her coat, her blue dress, everything. She piled every blanket, every fur, the buffalo robe, by the fire, and she lay down beside him, her own warm, pregnant, naked body, and she wrapped herself around his frozen one. She put his hands on her belly. She pressed her face to his. She lay against him by the fire, her own life, her own heat, a shield against the death that was trying to claim him, and she sobbed, not in fear, in fury. "Don't you dare leave me!" She wept into his frozen ear. "Don't you dare!" He woke hours later. The first feeling was warmth. The second was pain. The third was Helena. She was asleep, her body still wrapped around his, her breath warm on his neck, her round, hard belly pressed against his side. His leg was broken, but he was alive. He was home. He survived. The leg was a bad break, and it would heal with a limp, but he survived. Their bond, forged in gunfire and confessions, was now tempered in this shared brush with death. He was laid up for weeks, his legs splinted, his chair by the fire, his new prison. And in that quiet, snowbound time, they truly found each other. The last, deepest, darkest ghosts. They came out. I was so afraid," she whispered one night, her head on his good knee, her hands on her own belly, where the baby now kicked, a constant, joyful riot of losing you. Like I lost her. And she told him. Not the facts, but the feeling, the cold, the silence of the baby, after she had cried, the smallness of the grave, the name she had never spoken. "Sarah?" she whispered. I think I would have called her Sarah." Eli, his face in shadow, listened. He stroked her hair, and when she was done, his own voice, low and rough, filled the quiet. "Thomas," he said. She looked up. He had never, not once, spoken his brother's name in this way. He was younger and foolish. He always wanted to be more than he was. He fell in with the rustlers. I didn't know, not for sure. I should have." He looked into the fire. "The raid, it wasn't a raid. It was, they came for me because I had found out about Thomas. I told him to make it right. He brought them to stop me, but they turned on him too." He choked, the old, terrible grief rising. He died in my arms. Right out there, by the barn. He looked at me. He said, "I'm sorry, Eli." He bled out in the dust, and I held him, but I was so angry. I don't know if I ever forgave him. He was weeping. Eli Thatcher, her mountain, her stone, was weeping, silent, hard, terrible tears that tracked into his beard. Helena rose. She sat on his lap, her pregnant body awkward, and she wrapped her arms around his head. She held him, his face pressed against their child, and they cried. They cried for Sarah. They cried for Thomas. They cried for the brother who was lost to weakness, and the daughter who was lost to cold. They cried for the years of silence and the pain they had carried alone, and in the small, warm, snowbound cabin, they cried together, and they began, finally, to heal. Spring arrived. It came as a rush, a flood of green. The snows melted, the creek roared, and Eli's leg healed. He walked with a limp, a permanent reminder, but he walked. Helena's time came. It was a warm, bright May morning. The windows were open. The sound of her bees, a low, happy hum, filled the air. It was not easy. It was hard, and it was painful, and it was loud, but it was not cold, and she was not alone. Eli was there. He did not leave her side. He was terrified, his face pale, his hands useless. But he was there. He held her hand, his own knuckles white. He wiped her face with a cool cloth. He whispered her name. And when the final, tearing scream came, it was followed by a new sound, a sound that was not thin or weak or fading, a loud, red-faced, furious, wailing cry, a cry of life. Mr. Gideon, the preacher, had told them to fetch Mrs. Gable, but there had been no time. Eli had done it. He had caught his child. He was crying. He held the baby, this small, red, messy, wailing thing, in his large, shaking hands. It's a girl. Helena, he choked out, his voice thick. It's a girl. He laid the baby, cleaned and wrapped, in Helena's arms. Helena looked at her. She was perfect. She had a shock of dark hair. She had her father's chin. Eli knelt by the bed. He looked at his daughter. He looked at his wife. He touched the baby's cheek with one calloused, reverent finger. "You're home," he whispered. He was talking to the baby. He was talking to Helena. He was talking to all of them. "You're home." They named her Thomasina, a name that was for his brother, but was all her own. Tommy. The ranch was loud. It was full of new sounds. The cry of a baby, the laughter of a woman, the low, happy rumble of a man's voice, singing a tuneless, terrible song. One evening, in the late summer, Helena took a small packet of seeds, wildflowers, the ones she had seen in the high meadows. She walked, her daughter on her hip, to the ridge, to the place where Thomas was buried, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross. She knelt, and she planted the wildflowers. She planted them for Thomas, the boy Eli had lost. She planted them for Sarah, the girl she had lost. She planted them for her past, for the girl in the cellar, for the woman who had arrived in rags. And she planted them for Tommy, the new life, sleeping in her arms. She was not burying the past. She was tending to it, making it part of the new, strong, beautiful thing she was growing. A shadow, a hawk, passed overhead, its shadow sweeping over the grass. Helena watched it, and for the first time in her life, she did not flinch. In the final scene, the sun was setting. It was autumn, a year later. The air was crisp, the sky a deep, bruised purple. Eli and Helena sat on the porch he had widened, making it a place to live, not just to pass through. Eli was in his chair, his bad leg propped up, his limp a familiar, comforting part of him. Helena was beside him, her hand in his, and between them, on a thick blanket, a small, dark-haired girl, now a year old, was methodically and very seriously trying to put her father's hat into her own mouth. The light was golden. It lit the dust motes. It caught the new, silver-gray hairs at Eli's temples. It lit the fine, happy lines around Helena's eyes. They sat in silence, a comfortable, deep, lived-in silence. Not everything was healed. The scars were there. The limp was real. The nightmares, though rarer, still came. The graves on the hill were still graves. But everything was real, and real, in this land, at this light, with this man and this child. Real was enough. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I truly hope it moved you. My name is, and always will be, your faithful narrator. We would be so honored if you'd let us know where in the world you're listening from. Please, leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West, so you never miss a story. And finally, we would love to hear your thoughts on Helena and Eli's journey, so please share them with us in English. Your words mean the world to us. Thank you.